Okay, picture this. East Asia, early 19th century, you've got China, this huge ancient empire looking pretty secure, dominant.
Right, the center of the world in its own view.
And then you have Japan, this island nation, deliberately shut off, isolationist.
God's tight.
Fast forward just a few decades, and wow, the picture is completely flipped. It's almost unrecognizable.
It really is an astonishing transformation.
Mm-hmm.
China finds itself struggling, facing humiliation, while Japan is, well, aggressively modernizing in ways nobody could have predicted back then.
And that's exactly what we're diving into today. These incredibly different, often quite turbulent paths to modernization across East Asia. We'll focus mainly on Japan and China, naturally, because their stories are so contrasting.
But we'll also touch on Taiwan and Korea because they have their own unique, complex histories within this whole process, too.
Yeah, definitely. We've been digging into a set of sources that really map out these journeys, how these nations dealt with huge external pressures, massive internal changes, all in the effort to become, modern states.
Mm-hmm. Trying to figure out how to survive and thrive in a rapidly changing world dominated by Western powers at the time.
So our mission today is to unpack all that. Look at the key moments, the big ideas, and try to understand why they took such different routes.
And what that divergence means, really, for understanding the region and the world today.
Exactly. Okay, let's get into it. Japan first.
Let's start there. So, early 19th century Japan, you have the emperor in Kyoto, symbolically important, but the real power. That's with the shogun in Edo, modern-day Tokyo.
Right, the military leader.
And the country is divided into these domains run by lords, the daimyo, who are kept in line by the shogun. Then you have the samurai, the warrior class, but they're mostly administrators by this point.
And the key policy, as we said, was isolation, sakoku. Very little contact with the outside world.
Deliberately so. But that couldn't last.
No. Enter Commodore Perry.
Yep.
1853.
Yep. The black ships. Perry's arrival, backed by, considerable naval firepower, basically forced Japan to open its doors.
And that external shock just ripped through the internal political system.
It absolutely did. It sparked massive upheaval, led pretty directly to the fall of the shogunate and the restoration of the emperor to direct rule in 1868. That's the Meiji Restoration.
A pivotal moment. Edo becomes Tokyo, the new capital. Everything starts changing.
And the new Meiji leaders, they had a very clear, almost brutally pragmatic slogan. Fukoku Kyohei.
Rich country, strong army.
Exactly. It was about survival. They looked around, saw places like India being colonized, and realized, okay, we need wealth and we need military strength to stand up to the West. It was that simple and that urgent.
And they moved incredibly fast. The sources mention things like setting up an agricultural tax to fund everything right away.
Building the first railway. Tokyo to Yokohama took just 2 years, 1870 to 72. That's astonishing speed.
Importing machinery, hiring foreign experts left and right, but also, crucially, sending their own people out.
Yes, sending students abroad to Britain, France, Germany, the U.S. to learn everything science, engineering, politics, military strategy, and bringing that knowledge back. They even launched a modern banking system by 1872.
They weren't just building things, they were building capacity, building national companies too, right? Like Mitsubishi.
Absolutely. Mitsubishi, Sumitomo. These companies got government subsidies to become major shipbuilders. The goal was clear. Japanese trade should be carried on Japanese ships, keep the profits, build the expertise at home. Very strategic.
What I find fascinating is how this wasn't just some top-level economic or military project. It really filtered down into everyday life, into culture.
Oh, definitely. You see a shift in family structures.
Mm-hmm.
The traditional big multi-generational household starts giving way to something closer to the Western idea of a nuclear family. They even borrowed the word homu from English home.
Really? Homu?
Yeah. And that changes demand, People want different kinds of houses, different goods. The sources mention cheap housing becoming available in the 1920s. You could put down 200 yen and pay 12 yen a month.
And how much was someone earning then?
Well, a college-educated bank employee might make around 40 yen a month, so it was becoming attainable for a growing middle class. It shows changing aspirations.
That really does put it in perspective. And cities were transforming. Electric trams, parks, department stores.
And new ways of spending leisure time. That term, jinbura, just aimlessly strolling through the Ginza district in Tokyo, captures that sense of new urban freedom and consumer culture.
And you had figures like the moga, the modern girl.
Right. The moga, a symbol of, changing gender roles, a more cosmopolitan outlook, kind of pushing boundaries. Plus, you get radio in 1925, a booming film industry.
Yeah.
It was a really dynamic, energetic period, people questioning old norms.
But underneath all this progress, there were some serious political tensions brewing. Nationalism was getting pretty intense.
Very intense. The Meiji Constitution did create a parliament, the Diet, but its powers were quite limited. The real power stayed with the group of leaders, the oligarchs, who orchestrated the restoration.
And the military.
The military gained significant power and influence. They interpreted the Constitution to mean they answered directly to the emperor, not the civilian government, especially after 1890. This fear of the West, which initially spurred modernization.
Also fueled this drive for military power and expansion.
Exactly. Higher taxes for the military, a more aggressive foreign policy. It seemed like the logical extension of strong army.
Which led directly to war, beating China in 1894-95.
And then stunningly, defeating Russia, a major European power, in 1904-05. This cemented Japan's status as a rising power.
And led to empire building. Taiwan annexed in 1895, Korea in 1910.
Right. But this success abroad came at a cost. It definitely suppressed democratic movements developing at home, and it created deep resentment and conflict in the colonies. A very harsh rule often.
This aggressive, state-centered nationalism just kept growing, didn't it? Culminating in the 1930s and 40s.
Yeah, it really peaked then, pulling Japan into wider conflict in Asia and ultimately World War II. Society became highly controlled, dissent was repressed, patriotic societies were everywhere.
There was that interesting symposium you mentioned, Overcoming Modernity.
Yes, in 1943, intellectuals debating how Japan could be modern but somehow not Western, how to resist Western cultural dominance while still being a modern nation. A very complex, fraught discussion happening even as the war raged.
And of course, that path led to devastating defeat in 1945 and the U.S. occupation.
A total reset moment. The U.S. occupation from 45 to 47 brought huge changes. Demilitarization was key, including Article 9 in the new Constitution, the famous No War Clause.
And other reforms. Land reform?
Significant land reform, yes. Breaking up large estates, also reestablishing trade unions, and attempting, though, with mixed long-term success to dismantle the zaibatsu.
Those giant family-controlled conglomerates like Mitsui, Mitsubishi.
Exactly. They dominated the pre-war economy and had close ties to the military. The occupation tried to break them up, and a huge social change. Women got the vote in 1946 for the first time.
Then came the post-war economic miracle. How did that happen so fast?
It was remarkable. By the 70s, Japan was an economic giant again. The sources point to a few things. Deep historical roots, like traditions of popular struggle that maybe laid groundwork for participation. Strong social cohesion, allowing government, bureaucracy, and industry to work really closely together.
And U.S. support can't be ignored.
Definitely not. Especially the economic boost from U.S. procurement during the Korean War and later the Vietnam War. That provided significant demand.
And you had these powerful symbols of recovery like the '64 Tokyo Olympics.
Or the Shinkansen, the bullet train, launched the same year.
Yeah.
Huge symbols of technological prowess and economic rebirth.
But that rapid growth had a dark side, too, environmentally.
Oh, yes. Terrible pollution problems emerged in the 60s and 70s. Mercury poisoning, cadmium poisoning, horrific industrial diseases.
The people pushed back.
They did. Strong grassroots environmental movements arose and forced the government and industry to act. Japan ended up adopting some of the world's strictest environmental controls because of that pressure. Now, the challenge is different how to maintain its position, use its capabilities wisely.
Okay, so that's Japan. Rapid, elite-driven modernization, empire, war, defeat, and this incredible post-war comeback. Now, China. A completely different story unfolds there.
Radically different. Early 19th century, the Qing dynasty is ruling this vast territory, but it's already facing serious internal problems, rebellions, corruption, administrative decay. This is before the major Western impact.
There had been some earlier contact, right? Jesuit missionaries.
Centuries earlier, yes. They introduced some Western science and mathematics, but it was limited in scope and impact on the broader system. The real systemic challenge came in the 19th century.
Starting with the Opium Wars. Brutal.
Absolutely brutal and deeply humiliating. The First Opium War, 1839-42. Fundamentally, Britain used force to make China accept the opium trade, which was incredibly profitable for Britain.
Part of that triangular trade involving India.
Exactly. Opium grown in British India, shipped to China, traded for silver, which Britain then used to buy Chinese tea and silk. The war shattered the image of Qing invincibility, exposed its weakness, and fueled urgent calls for change within China.
This fear of being carved up like other places must have been palpable.
Hugely so. Reformers like Kang Youwei and Liang Qikou saw the danger clearly. They argued China had to modernize its administration, its military, its education system, even consider a constitutional government, or risk colonization.
You mentioned they were afraid of being Polanded.
Yes, that phrase really captures the fear. Referring to Poland being partitioned by its stronger neighbors in the 18th century, it became a verb almost to Poland us. Liang Qikou also pointed to India, calling it a country destroyed by a non-country, meaning the British East India Company. A powerful warning about what could happen.
Chilling. And a big part of their proposed solution involved questioning deeply rooted traditions.
Yes, a lot of reformers felt that traditional thinking, especially Confucianism, as it was practiced and used by the state, was holding China back, preventing the adoption of new ideas and institutions.
So how did they try to bring in new knowledge?
One key way was sending students abroad. Many went to Japan, especially in the 1890s. Japan had already started modernizing and was translating Western works. Chinese students brought back not just ideas, but even vocabulary, adopting Japanese terms for Western concepts, written with the same Chinese characters.
That's fascinating linguistic borrowing. And the biggest symbolic break with tradition, the examination system.
Abolishing the civil service examination system in 1905. This system had been the pathway into the ruling elite for centuries.
Based on classical literature, not science or tech.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Memorizing classics, writing in rigid formats like the eight-legged essay, very low pass rates. Scrapping it was a massive statement. China needed a different kind of knowledge, a different kind of elite for the modern world.
All these pressures eventually boiled over. The Qing dynasty collapsed.
In 1911, the revolution overthrew the Manchu Empire. Sun Yat-sen established the Republic of China. He's widely considered the founder of modern China.
And his guiding ideas were the three principles.
The Sanminchui, nationalism, which meant overthrowing the Manchu rulers, seen as foreign and resisting foreign imperialism. Democracy, establishing republican government. And socialism, or people's livelihood, which involved regulating capital and trying to equalize land ownership. A very ambitious program.
But founding the republic didn't exactly bring peace and stability.
Far from it. Decades of turmoil followed. Warlords carved up the country. The central government was weak. A key moment shaping the future was the May 4th movement in 1919.
What sparked that?
It started as a student protest against the Treaty of Versailles after World War I. The treaty gave Germany's former concessions in China to Japan, even though China had been on the Allied side.
It must have caused outrage.
Massive outrage. It galvanized a whole generation. They attacked traditional culture, calling for Mr. Science and Mr. Democracy. They demanded kicking out foreigners, reducing inequality, ending poverty. They also advocated for social reforms using vernacular Chinese instead of classical, abolishing foot binding, promoting women's rights, economic development, a real watershed moment.
And out of this ferment, two major political forces emerged, vying for control. The Kuomintang, the GMD.
And the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP.
Chiang Kai-shek took over the GMD after Sun Yat-sen died. What was his approach?
Chiang focused heavily on military unification. While he paid lip service to Sun's principles, his rule became increasingly authoritarian. Interestingly, he tried to blend modern state building with a revival of traditional Confucian values, particularly regarding women's roles. His base was primarily urban, the cities, the business elite.
And they struggled to connect with the countryside.
Largely, yes. There was some industrial growth under the GMD, but often with poor conditions for workers. And crucially, they didn't effectively address the massive issues of land tenure and poverty faced by the peasantry, which was the vast majority of the population. That failure left a huge opening.
An opening the communists, especially Mao Zedong, exploited.
Precisely. The CCP was founded in 1921, initially influenced by the Russian Revolution, looking towards urban workers. But Mao's great radical innovation was to recognize the revolutionary potential of the peasantry.
Shifting the focus from the city to the countryside.
Exactly. He established rural bases like the Jiangxi Soviet from 1928 to 1934. There, the communists experimented with land redistribution, giving land to poor peasants, and built their own independent army, the Red Army.
And Mao paid attention to social issues too, like women's roles.
He did. He saw the oppression of women as part of the old system. They encouraged women's associations, pushed for reforms like a new marriage law giving women more rights. He also conducted these incredibly detailed social surveys, like the one in Zunwu in 1930, really digging into the lives, the problems, the exploitation faced by ordinary people, that built deep grassroots support.
This rivalry inevitably led to civil war, interrupted by that incredible ordeal, the Long March.
Yes, the GMD military campaigns eventually forced the CCP out of Jiangxi. The Long March 1934-35 was this epic, brutal retreat, thousands of miles over mountains and rivers under constant attack to a new remote base in Yan'an in the northwest.
But surviving that somehow strengthened them.
In a way, yes. It became a foundational myth, a symbol of resilience. In Yan'an, they regrouped, refined their program, ending warlordism, land reform, fighting Japanese imperialism, and further solidified their peasant base. They did form a united front with the GMD to fight Japan during World War II.
An easy alliance.
Very uneasy. But after Japan's defeat in 1945, the Civil War resumed almost immediately. And the Communists, with their popular support, disciplined army, and effective guerrilla tactics, ultimately prevailed.
Leading to the founding of the People's Republic of China in 1949.
October 1st, 1949, Mao declared the PRC in Beijing. Initially, the program was called New Democracy.
Not full communism straight away.
No, it was presented as an alliance of classes workers, peasants, the urban petty bourgeoisie, and even the national bourgeoisie, capitalists seen as patriotic, all working together under CCP leadership to rebuild China. The state took control of key sectors, but private enterprise and land ownership were phased out more gradually.
Then came the shift towards socialism proper.
Yes, launched in 1953. This led to collectivization of agriculture and eventually the Great Leap Forward in 1958.
The Great Leap Forward. That sounds ambitious.
Hugely ambitious and ultimately disastrous. It was Mao's attempt to achieve rapid industrialization almost overnight, famously through things like backyard steel furnaces in villages, and to leap into communism through giant agricultural collectives called people's communes.
Trying to change the economy and the people simultaneously.
Exactly. Mao wanted to create a new socialist man, motivated by ideology, committed to the collective. Mass organizations were formed to mobilize everyone, but the economic policies were often based on wishful thinking rather than expertise, leading to widespread famine and economic disruption.
And this created tensions within the leadership between Mao's ideological focus and more pragmatic approaches.
Deep tensions. Leaders like Liu Shaoqi and Deng Xiaoping tried to moderate the extremes after the Great Leap's failure, emphasizing expertise and more rational economic planning. Mao saw this as a betrayal of the revolution, a slide back towards capitalism.
Which led to the Cultural Revolution.
The Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution, launched by Mao in 1965-66. It was an attempt to purge his rivals, reignite revolutionary spirit, and attack perceived bourgeois influences.
A period of incredible chaos, right?
Immense chaos.
Yeah.
Mao mobilized young people, the Red Guards, along with parts of the army to attack the four old ideas. Culture, customs, habits, intellectuals, teachers, even party officials were persecuted. Universities closed, factories were disrupted. Ideology trumped expertise. It was incredibly destructive.
How long did that last?
The most intense phase lasted a few years, maybe until 1969, but the political turmoil and its effects continued until Mao's death in 1976. Only after that did the focus shift decisively back towards economic development.
Paving the way for Deng Xiaoping and the reform era starting in 1978.
Right. Deng introduced what he called a socialist market economy, basically allowing market forces, private farming, foreign investment, while maintaining the absolute political control of the Communist Party.
The goal being the four modernizations.
Science, industry, agriculture, and national defense. That was the focus. Some debate and discussion were allowed, but there was a clear line. You could not challenge the party's leading role.
But the people did push for more political freedom, didn't they?
They did. Almost immediately, there were calls for a fifth modernization democracy. A famous poster went up on Democracy Wall in Beijing in 1978, arguing that political freedom was essential for the other modernizations to succeed.
And these calls culminated in 1989.
Yes, in the large-scale, student-led protests centered on Tiananmen Square in Beijing, demanding political reform, an end to corruption, and greater freedom. The movement gained broad support, but was ultimately crushed by the military in June 1989. A brutal crackdown.
Leaving China on its current path, economic opening under tight political control.
That's the dominant model. Party leadership combined with market liberalization and integration into the global economy. It's produced incredible economic growth, lifted millions out of poverty.
But it's not without internal critics or challenges.
No. Critics point to growing inequality between coast and interior, rich and poor, urban and rural. Social tensions exist, and there's this interesting resurgence of traditional ideas like Confucianism being discussed again. Can China find a modern path rooted in its own traditions, not just following the West or a purely Marxist model? That debate is ongoing.
So, Japan and China, starkly different journeys. One driven by elite response to external threat, leading to empire defeat and a specific kind of post-war success. The other, a long internal revolution against decay and foreign pressure, culminating in a powerful centralized state embracing market forces. Fascinating comparison.
Truly. But let's not forget Taiwan and Korea. Their paths add even more complexity.
Right. Taiwan's story starts in its modern phase with the GMD retreat there in 1949.
Yes, Chiang Kai-shek and the GMD fled the mainland and set up rule in Taiwan, which had been a Japanese colony for 50 years. Initially, their rule was authoritarian, suppressing the local Taiwanese population.
But they did implement land reform.
Crucially, yes. Successful land reform redistributed land from landlords to tillers, which boosted agriculture and created a more equitable base. And they oversaw impressive economic development.
Becoming one of Asia's tigers.
Absolutely. By the early 70s, Taiwan had the second highest GNP per capita in Asia, right after Japan. And notably, this growth happened alongside decreasing income inequality, which is quite rare.
And then came a transition to democracy.
A dramatic one, especially from the late 1980s. After Chiang Kai-shek's son, Chiang Ching-kuo, initiated reforms before his death, martial law was lifted in 1987. Opposition parties formed, and free elections eventually brought the locally rooted Democratic Progressive Party to power, marking a full democratic transition, though its international status remains complicated.
And Korea. Also a story of colonization, division, war.
A very painful history. Korea's own modernization efforts were cut short by Japanese annexation in 1910. After liberation in 1945, it was tragically divided north and south. Then came the devastating Korean War, 1950-53, a proxy conflict of the Cold War that sealed the division.
South Korea then focused heavily on economic growth under authoritarian regimes.
Yes, think Park Chung-hee. Strong state intervention guiding industrialization. One interesting example is the Simol Indong, the New Village movement, launched in 1970.
What was that about?
It aimed to modernize the countryside, improving infrastructure, housing, but also had this explicit goal of changing people's spirit, encouraging diligence, self-help, cooperation, very much a top-down mobilization effort.
And that economic growth eventually fueled demands for political change.
Exactly. Rapid industrialization created a larger urban middle class, expanded education massively, and increased political awareness. People started demanding democratic rights.
Leading to the big breakthrough in 1987.
The June Democracy Movement. Huge street protests involving students, workers, the middle class, forced the military-backed government to concede to constitutional reforms, including direct presidential elections. A real victory for people power.
And South Korea's democracy has continued to mature since then.
Yes. You see it in later events, like the peaceful candlelight protests in 2016 that led to the impeachment of a president. The sources emphasize this link. Economic development created the social conditions, but it was active citizen mobilization that actually achieved democratization.
So looking across all four, Japan, China, Taiwan, South Korea, you really see that modernization isn't just one path.
Not at all. It underscores the idea that industrial societies emerge from vastly different historical conditions and find their own, often contested ways forward.
Japan's relatively swift state-led modernization versus China's prolonged revolutionary transformation.
And Taiwan's development under an exiled regime that later democratized versus South Korea's democracy born from struggles against authoritarianism fueled by economic change. All distinct trajectories within the same broad challenge.
What's so compelling is how these choices, these different strategies, didn't just shape economies and politics, but everything down to society, culture, daily life.
Absolutely. These historical paths created the foundations of the societies we see today, with all their strengths and tensions.
So where does that leave us? Reflecting on these histories, it's clear the decisions made in these tumultuous periods have incredibly long-lasting consequences, shaping not just these nations, but the entire global landscape.
It shows that modernization isn't some neat, predictable formula. It's always a dynamic interplay between global pressures, local traditions, leadership choices, and crucially, the actions and aspirations of ordinary people.
Which makes you wonder, considering these incredibly varied, often painful journeys, is there such a thing as an ideal way to modernize? Or is it always going to be a unique, messy, perhaps even contradictory process, deeply shaped by the specific time, place, culture, and the people navigating it? What really stands out to you when you hear these stories laid side by side?